Thanks for tuning in to The Leadership Beat, a Bates Communications original podcast series exploring leadership trends and inspiring leaders to innovate and think differently.
I'm Sarah Woods, and welcome to The Leadership Beat. Today I'm talking with Gunjan Kedia, Vice Chairman of U.S. Bank's Wealth Management and Investor Services Division. Over the course of her career, Gunjan has consistently challenged conventional thinking in a relatively entrenched industry by pushing for greater breadth of thought and innovation. In fact, Gunjan herself hosted a podcast called Giving Voice to Wealth, highlighting visionary leaders. I met Gunjan a few years back when she was on the management committee at State Street Bank, leading a multi-billion-dollar global business unit. And I'm delighted to be talking today about her unique lens on leadership. Gunjan, welcome to the Leadership Beat.
Thank you, Sarah. It's lovely to be here.
So Gunjan, your career has spanned both consulting with PwC and McKinsey and executive leadership with two of the world's largest financial institutions. What are some of the lessons learned over the years that have changed the way you lead?
You know, Sarah, it is sort of implicit in your question that leadership has changed meaningfully over the years, but maybe I'll say the obvious. You know, when I started my career in the early 90s, leaders motivated through the traditional money, promotions, power, progression in your career. Today, when I think of the teams I lead, they're just different. The face of our followers are quite different. They are motivated more by mission, by a purpose, by work-life balance, flexibility in how they work, their impact on their societies and their communities. So it is different. I feel I'm leading for a different follower. You know, the other thing I would say that has really been different in the last few decades is just the impact of technology on leaders. You'll remember a time when, technology was just this function on the side. And the pace of change that, digital business models has introduced to almost any business. It's not just banking where the impact is profound, but in any other businesses has caused all of us to think about strategy differently. There's more uncertainty in how we define. There's a shorter horizon. There's more agility. So it does feel different to be a leader today than, a decade back.
Yeah, well, you described leading for a different follower, which is a very interesting observation. So with that in mind, what are us baby boomers getting wrong about how the new workforce looks at leadership?
Wow, this is actually a fairly interesting dynamic in the workplace, to be honest. And I think it mirrors what's happening in our society. I have teenage kids who are just a little bit younger than millennials, but they defend the cause of the millennials when I make comments that they don't like. And they have introduced me to this eyeball rolling, okay, boomer phrase. I don't know if you have seen it. We don't quite see this type of a war at the workplace, but the dynamic is quite interesting. Baby boomers are staying longer. Some of it is just financial because retirement is the real issue in our society. But Sarah, a lot of it is because they're fit, they're energetic, they have a lot to contribute, and they don't want to sit and play golf. So we have a growing number of boomers in the workplace, and of course we have millennials coming in, and they coexist. And where it works, it's wonderful. Their skill sets are very, very complementary and very additive to each other. But the cultural differences are very real. So I'll capture the stereotypes, then maybe I'll give you my perception of where the stereotypes are just nonsensical. So the baby boomers have come up with a very different work ethic where you work first and then play once you retire. And millennials want to do it at the same time. Boomers have a time horizon where they commit to a company. They're used to compensation structures that reward longevity or tenure at a company. They're used to respect for hierarchy. And then with millennials, none of those are true. In fact, it's very common for a new intern who might hear me speak at a new employee orientation to send me a note. And they'll say, I have some ideas for you. My outlook is current. Please set up some time for a coffee. So we do see cultural differences between the two. But I'll tell you what I think is beyond kind of the cultural difference. The real challenge from a management and leadership standpoint of two very different type of workers is the millennials are effortlessly digital, effortlessly diverse, and effortlessly sort of connected to the world through social media. And a lot of the baby boomers feel like they have struggled with those skill sets. On the other hand, what's happening with the millennials is this, what I call the attention span issue. They get bored, they want to move on, they want to do exciting things that change the world tomorrow. And because I lead the wealth management organization, I also see the impact of not staying with the job. Millennials have the least amount of investment assets accumulated at this age compared to any other generation. So I think there are some real issues. It's kind of fun to have teams across the two of them, but I will say that we are quite blessed as leaders to have access to both experience and judgment and forward thinking and digital thinking. I love it, I must say. I love it.
Yeah, and one of the things that you mentioned earlier was this notion that millennials are attracted to mission-driven organizations and are working for a different purpose than the baby boomers may have been working for. So when you think about that, what challenge does that present for executive leadership when they're trying to balance this concept of a mission-driven organization against the expectations and interests of shareholders?
Well, this debate is being vocalized in quite public forums, and I think it's a healthy debate. My personal view is that the mission and shareholder returns are not in conflict with each other. One leads to the other, but it does cause us to think differently about how we run our businesses. So, one of my interesting personal observation is, for the longest time, businesses were a little bit like Americans in general. You did your work and you did it for the profit motive, and you talked about the weather, but you did not wade in as a business into politics or ideological issues or policy making where society was concerned. I will tell you, today's leaders do not have that luxury. One is our clients and our employees sort of demand that we take a stance on issues. Our shareholders are increasingly asking us questions that are beyond shareholder returns. So, for example, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard are three of the largest passive investors. And increasingly, they have asked questions. State Street's agenda has been around women on boards. BlackRock has asked questions about environment. So shareholders, along with employees, along with clients, are making businesses have a voice on mission-related things. And, the dynamic is very interesting because, none of us studied this in an MBA, right? To say, how do you deal with it? But you'll have issues all the way from private prisons or gun control or mining rights or minimum wage. And we'll get a lot of letters. And they're both sides. They argue both sides. We think of it as a 50-50 world. Half of them want us to wade into doing one thing. Half of them want us to wade into doing something. So balance becomes the leadership skill. And it's a very nuanced balance. You have to remember you serve all constituents equally. Although on any one day and any one issue, somebody's claims might be heavier on us than others. So it is a different leadership mindset for sure. And I have certainly arrived at a point when I don't think of it as mission versus money. I think of it money with the mission as a mindset.
Well, and so looking forward, when you think about your leadership, when you think about that changing dynamic and the workforce that is coming up through the organization, is there anything that you'll be doing differently in the way that you lead?
Wow, that's a very, it requires some introspection. Some of it is to just think about getting the today sort of right. And maybe it's a little bit of a continuation of the journey. I am an acute observer of the needs of the people I'm leading and how they are changing and how that means I need to change. And sometimes, as you know, that's not a comfortable journey. We were sort of taught to lead a certain way. And just when you think you sort of mastered that, you're unwinding some of those skill sets. especially for women, and I don't want to make this a diversity conversation, but you will relate to it in your coaching career. Certainly as a young woman growing up in banking, the feedback you would get a lot of time is assertiveness, the kind of a dictatorial, overconfident style of management that we often saw in men, but not in women, was sort of important to cultivate. And today, that's sort of unfashionable. And in some ways, you're coming straight back to a different kind of a leader. I will say, you've known me for a long time. I have a very direct style of talking. And today, instead of coaching myself to not do that, it's a sort of authentic leadership is quite valued. People appreciate the truth. Nobody likes corporate speak anymore. So there are some sort of back to basics type of leadership things that I am readapting, I would say. There are some things I'm unwinding because we used to be quite kind of straight focused on careers. You thought you would reward people by giving them 100-hour work week and $1 million before they ever imagined. See, now that may not be the right motivator. In fact, we were looking at our benefits. It was such a funny thing to learn. And we did a whole series of enhancements to our employee benefits. And as a leadership team, we had some perceptions on what people would like a lot and what they would like less. But you know what was the most popular part of the package that we rolled out? We gave our employees 2 extra paid volunteer days. And I got more letters on that than the fact that we were matching their healthcare. We were going to keep it flat. We were going to offer mental illness benefits. And we had a very substantive set of things. But the things that got most excitement going, the 2 extra days of volunteer work. So, you have to watch it and you have to learn from, what your teams are about and what your clients are about and hopefully adapt accordingly.
So that pivot you're describing is something I think that you've been quoted as saying in a previous article I read, which is, my success comes less from what I know and more from what I ask and learn from others. And that sounds like that pivot that you're talking about making in your leadership.
Well, it is I don't remember the article, but it sounds like me because it is sort of true to my philosophy that, static leaders sort of lose their audience a little bit. Now, that being said, a lot of leadership conversations like we are having today are about what's different. And in many of the times when I'm talking, especially to younger audiences, it is sort of important to remind them of the basics of leadership that do matter. There are some things that are bellwether that don't change. And we assume that people sort of take that for granted. But sometimes you do have to remind them. I'll tell you, I used a phrase once, and I don't know where it came to me, but I must have been in a particularly soft and touchy-feely employee event. And I was in a budget mindset and perhaps in an impatient mood. And they kept talking to me about, how are you cultivating empathy and how do you listen more? How do you let people have a voice? And so I just made a comment and I was very pleased and surprised to see how much it resonated with even a very young audience. And I'll describe that to you. I acknowledged what they were talking about. And I said, look, it's very normal for you to want leaders that make you feel good about yourself, make you feel good about. But career progression also comes from being good, not just feeling good. So also look for the people who will teach you hard skills, people who will teach you to cut through enormous amount of data and information and be clear-eyed about strategy and what will make a difference. Be very mindful about things that will create your competitive edge in a highly competitive world. Teach skills that are agile, where you can focus very much on the outside market, not on your own. So I always want to at least add that footnote in every conversation that while the more interesting parts are what's different, some of the things that are bellwethers sort of need to be reminded and talked about sometimes too. So anyway, I've got a lot of people saying, oh, thank you for saying, don't just pick leaders to feel good, but also to be good.
Yes. And so to that end, aside from your role at U.S. Bank, I know you're passionate about a few other things as well. What else are you working on that's personally important to you right now?
Well, there is something that has been growing in my mind, and maybe I'll use this just as a way of describing, the concern and hence the passion to make a difference here. I have been involved in some ways with wealth management and asset management for 3 decades. And some of the issues we have talked about are not new, like retirement security, like the need to make sure that we are not relying on the state or a social security type of a safety network. So those conversations have been had for a long time. My new focus on this is more around kind of women and wealth. If I could put it this way, there are bellwether issues around wealth and savings. But what I have observed just through personal friendships and through data that I have seen is that the issue impacts women more. So I don't know if you know these facts. We have all been celebrating 50% of the college graduates being women, which is terrific progress for us. But what we don't talk about is 2/3 of the student debt is being held by women today, because they take on as much debt, but they pick careers that tend to pay less. It takes them longer to pay debt. Over time, they help their friends and family more. They're more charitable. They don't particularly enjoy talking and manage about money or managing money, so they undermanage it. They live longer. And you put all of these things together, and in the end, you do find that the wealth gap becomes so much bigger than the income gap that many people have talked about. So I've done some very interesting things. You mentioned my podcast. That's an awareness building. I speak on this topic a lot. I'm on the board of a wonderful organization called Junior Achievement, when we're teaching middle school kids to begin to think about money. So this is sort of, if I can make a difference to more than zero number of women and minorities who are disproportionately impacted by lack of access to financial education, financial acumen, I think I'd be a happy person.
Well, given all that work now, and it's in a fantastic body of work at this stage in your career, and so important, when you look back now at that person that you were in your early 20s, and I remember your story of coming from India to Carnegie Mellon and making your way in America, what would you tell your 25-year-old self now?
Wow, you are right. As you asked the question, I go back and think about where was I 25 years back. When I was 21, when I came to the U.S., I had just finished my engineering in India, and I had very little exposure to the world. I have these really funny memories of struggling with the basics of the infrastructure of the U.S. Like I didn't know how to use ATMs and everything, like even an automated photo booth, which is what we used to have at that moment, used to really puzzle me. So I look back and I'm sort of glad that I had kind of enough sense of humor, enough courage and pizzazz to say I can do this. I can settle in a new country and just learn what I need to learn. If I do go back and I think about what has been a bellwether character trait that has helped me be successful, it's my curiosity, really. I have been very good at learning along the way. I have a level of interest and a level of humility about what's new, what's different. I have the ability to truly step out of my own belief system and engage in a different point of view. And whether you change your mind or not, at least it's a good exercise. So one thing I say to myself that I'm grateful for, another thing I'd say to a lot of other 25-year-olds who ask me is never stop learning to learn, even if you might have graduated from college. And it's fun, keeps you current, keeps you thinking. And on the flip side, if I had to say one thing which I wish I'd done less of, is to try and be somebody else. When you're young, it's very tempting to look at somebody who's in a leadership position and try to make yourself be someone different. And for me, I can't tell you how hard I worked on trying to change my accent. I was embarrassed about it. Lots of people couldn't understand it. And, all these years later, you're like, wow, what a waste of energy that was. So I do wish I had sort of the confidence and contentment to just be myself when I was 25.
Thank you, Gunjan, for sharing just wonderful insights, for your candor and your personal story. We've been so glad to have you join us at the Leadership Beat. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me.